welcome back to Solacene. This week we are continuing our semester designing the Rushmore of a utopia called the Solacene. This week, instead of choosing someone from history, we have decided to design a human being named Gustave.
His name is Gustave. This semester, thus far, each episode has been focused on a person from history who has really inspired us and therefore inspired our little pet imaginary utopia called the Solacene. So each episode has been, I would say, a balance of our more creative or world-building instincts with our kind of biographical or research-based ones. For instance, we talked about Shakespeare. We researched a lot about Shakespeare's life, read some of his plays, but also were thinking a little bit more analytically and creatively, drawing themes from his life. And for this week, we just decided, let's lean entirely into the sketching and we'll just create a dude, that's what I'm calling him, a dude,
Okay.
who is in some ways a composite of the people that we've covered thus far, but also, I think, an entirely original being or force even, a hero, let's say, a character who covers ground that the others kind of haven't. So I think it's going to be a really fun, if a little bit weird premise to explore. And I hope people don't get lost.
Yeah, you say he's a hero, but similarly to all of our other people we've covered in the semester, those people really shifted time. They had a huge, monumentous impact. But Gustave is going to be the everyman, the dude.
It's true.
He will be a small town hero, perhaps. And we'll get into that as we go through the episode.
Yeah, it was my idea that he would be a really earth-shaking sci-fi figure who discovers nuclear fission or figures out how to harness it, or I don't know, designs the Apple of the next century, or blimps, fixes blimps, let's say. But then you said, since we've celebrated so many of those figures thus far, maybe it would be more inclusive or more worthwhile a discussion to try and craft someone who is a bit more of a normal, or I don't want to say normal or attainable world-changingness, but someone who wouldn't ordinarily be carved onto stone in a Mount Rushmore, or maybe wouldn't have biographies written about them, because that kind of positivity and giving force, let's say, can be just as impressive, I think.
Exactly.
And for me, a lot harder to imagine.
True. So you and I have a plan that we haven't really talked about before, but that is to both die on the same day. And
okay, yeah.
The reason I'm saying that is because you have the idea that Gustave will be born on the day that you and I die.
I always love those links that people make in terms of reincarnation. They'll say such and such writer died in this year, the same year that this other poet was born. And so there's this kind of nice idea that the spirit lives on in that way. It was like a relay. And since we are currently the two existing Solacites, we thought that our deaths and Gustave's birth will be linked thus. And of course, we are going to die, fingers crossed, in the year 2100.
Yeah, that's the plan.
I think it'd be nice. We get to see 3 centuries, is what you said.
Exactly.
Born in 1999, live through the 2000s, and then die in the 2100s with a blimp flying over us.
Exactly, or in a blimp.
Dying in a blimp.
There we go.
Gustave could also be birthed in a birthing blimp. It'll be like the hypermodern, the image of the stork carrying the babies. Yeah. It'll be a blimp instead.
Okay.
Actually, that sounds more like a dystopia, but
that's what it is.
So we're getting into his early life, like a Wikipedia page. I think that'll be loosely the structure of this episode. Early life, personal life, career, maybe. What day is he born? / what day do we die?
I'm picturing, well, maybe just because it's March now, but a spring birth in 2100. And yeah, let's just say spring 2100. And he's born to parents who worked as an art curator and an anthropologist.
Okay.
Unnamed, but they gave him the name Gustave after Gustave Moreau.
So we should mention, Alicia and I didn't really correspond about Gustave's life. I just said his name will be Gustave, and we each just brought different things. So most likely, I think this fictional life will be a little bit over full for a life, because
Of course.
I'll have brought a life full of happenings, and so will you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that he is named after the French symbolist painter from the 1800s, Gustave Moreau. And the reasons I had for this, one, he is the Solacene recommends for this week.
Of course.
He's always been one of my favorite painters, but I also feel typically quite imposter-like saying that about someone whose art I've only ever seen on the internet.
Mm.
You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I love that painting so much. Yeah, I saw it on Google. And this may sound like quite an elitist thing to say. It's just always how I felt, a little bit inauthentic about that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, when we went to Paris a couple years ago, we stumbled by complete accident into his house/museum, where seems to be housed almost all of his great works. So highly recommend both museums in general and Gustave Moreau's paintings. How would you describe them? It's hard of a podcast, obviously.
They have this like dark mysticism about them.
Yeah.
A lot of paintings, you picture them having a white canvas, but with his, it's almost as if the canvas is black and then he's pulling colors out of it. And they often are depicting quite epic scenes. He has a lot of paintings from biblical scenes, I remember.
Yeah, something about his colors and mythological theming just, I won't say it's a direct inspiration for the Solacene, but it's always in the back of my mind whenever I'm writing fiction or thinking about things.
Yeah, he has these dark scenes he's painting, but they're optimistic in a way. The way that he uses color, I find, and little silver linings on everything.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps literally, but it figuratively also works, of perhaps depicting a really brutal scene from the Bible, but then you can see the beauty and the light behind it.
Yeah, and I think another Solacene recommends museums in general, because though Paris is obviously world renowned for a reason in that regard, I was also thinking that part of the reason that reputation persists maybe above all other cities to such an extent that it does is because people go to Paris to see museums. You know what I mean? Like, so much of it is propagated by travelers, vacationers who go to Paris and therefore fill their days by doing things like going to museums. And your city most likely isn't Paris in terms of museums, but it probably does have one or two.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they aren't world-renowned, ultra-famous painters housed within, I think most often you will find something that, if not spectacular, will somehow speak to you. So I guess Solacene recommends is just going to local museums and seeing what strikes your fancy.
It's interesting that that's your Solacene recommends, because I had Gustave growing up in and around museums.
Okay.
Which we, as you said, didn't correspond about. Mm-hmm. So that is a really big part of his childhood and adolescence, is that let's say his mom is an art curator, so she's constantly in different museums. And of course, his dad is an anthropologist, so he's also in and around museums of different types.
Well, you said, of course, his dad was an anthropologist. So.
Yeah. So I thought this was an interesting arc for him. So he was the Solacene equivalent, perhaps, to an extent, of an indoor kid. He was raised screenless, but indoors at museums, so constantly surrounded by other people's art and history and these types of things. That was his life up until he was 8 when his sister was born.
Oh dear, okay.
Yeah, so when his sister was born...
What's her name?
I didn't have a name for her.
What about, they all start with G's, so like Gertrude.
Gertrude. After Gertrude Stein.
Yeah.
There we go, okay. We have Gertrude. His sister is born when he's 8. And I had this idea that, maternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
So his parents both take a leave from work to be with the child for the first year, and they take what I'm calling an off-grid year. So the family goes and they live off-grid just for a year. The kids are, one of them is a baby, so they're not homeschooled, but Gustave is homeschooled for this year, and that's his first exposure to living outside of a city, because he grows up in a city, obviously, where the museums are.
Okay.
And so that was a really formative experience in his life, living off-grid and experiencing the really tactile side of existence.
So he gets his hands a little bit dirty. He starts swallowing some tree bark during that 1 year.
Yeah.
But you said even outside of that, he's raised screenless, which is a point that I also had. And a brief concern I raised before we started recording was that this conversation might devolve a little bit too often into us just discussing our ideal parenting plans for when we have children.
Yeah.
Gustave is basically going to be, this is the model for who we want to spawn, essentially.
Yeah.
So the screenlessness, I think the biggest result of this is that he has those bright screenless eyes that we talk about so often on the podcast.
Yeah.
People whose senses, perception, and attention span haven't been flattened, obscured, muddled by TikTok. I mean, it's Solacene, so TikTok won't even exist.
No.
But in any case, he doesn't Google things very often. And this is a foundational absence, let's say, which persists into his adulthood.
Yeah, and right now, screenless childhoods and both parents taking a leave for a child's birth is quite reserved for very wealthy people. But in the Solacene, this family isn't especially wealthy. I mean, I guess with those jobs right now, it seems, they might be wealthy.
I was thinking it'd be a little bit more middle class.
Yeah, so, but I'm just saying in the Solacene, with a bit more equity in the payment of jobs, they wouldn't necessarily be as rich as our curators and anthropologists are now. It would just be middle class.
Maybe we can say that his father is a failed anthropologist, or like a failing anthropologist.
Sure, we can say that.
Just to give it a bit of texture.
Okay, a little bit of grit.
A bit of a side note, talking as an extension of his screenlessness, I thought we could discuss how he might embody those 3 Solacene typifying traits, because we always describe the utopia as being beautiful, sustainable, and tactile. Mm-hmm. And we're talking, those words are often applied to like infrastructure or the land or the different parts of society that we've spoken about on this podcast before. But I was kind of asking the question, how could a person embody this?
Yeah, I think up until this point in his life, we're at age 8. So far, most of his life has been beauty-oriented. He's been developing a sense of aesthetics from a very young age. And until this point, it hadn't been that tactile. It's been mainly behind glass. Mm-hmm. The Solacene version of a screen, maybe. People who are raised in museums, they're not interacting with the objects. They're simply viewing it.
He's a nerd. Or was a nerd.
Yeah. And my thought was the experience off-grid didn't change him that much. It was more of a seed that was planted because he didn't really get it.
Okay.
He didn't like being outside. Like some kids, I find, don't like being outside.
So he didn't take to it immediately, start climbing trees.
Exactly. But it was a seed planted. He went back, and I pictured him for the next 4 or 5 years still remaining quite nerdish.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Oppenheimer, where it's like he's this quantum physics nerd who spends all his time in studies, but then he's like, oh, this is my ranch. Came here every day as a kid. Yeah. It's a little bit like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was thinking with the beauty, not just talking about his childhood, but the way we use that word, obviously, to describe people now is incredibly shallow and always about their hair and wrists. But in the Solacene, we could maybe take a fuller conception of the word. And obviously, we're not going to talk about how Gustave looks, but we can say that he's beautiful in all those things that he can impact, maybe like all those things that aren't predetermined and maybe aren't the most vain. So like the way he carries himself, the way he speaks, there's a certain grace there. But we could also say that he has, as you were mentioning, a good taste. Yeah. He surrounds himself with beautiful things, not necessarily the most expensive. Some of them are, free, or it's just going to the park or going to the museum. But he has, most importantly, an appreciation for such for aesthetics, let's say. Yeah. And also, I think key to this, one of his traits is that he's always curious. I had this quote this week about how, to paraphrase, it was something about how you only age when you stop being curious. And I feel like with Gustave, he never stops being curious because he too lives a long life. Maybe not quite as long as we do, but long enough.
That brings a good segue into the villain of the week. Do-do-do-do. That's the new villain of the week song. So, the villain of the week is named Mr. Felix. Mr. Felix was one of Gustave's teachers.
If people haven't listened to this podcast before, they have no idea what's going on.
Shut it down.
So just as each episode we're choosing a person to celebrate, we're having a small section for a person to denigrate, let's say.
Yeah, and this week the person is fictional. Usually the person has been real. Yeah. Ellen, for example.
Ellen DeGeneres, we don't. Satan.
So, Mr. Felix... Oh yeah, Satan was...
He was a villain of the week.
Yeah, I forgot. Okay. Mr. Felix was Gustave's math teacher for a few years in school, and Gustave was really good at math. Some people, have that knack.
Mhm.
But Mr. Felix was trying to steal him to the dark, non-creative side. But Gustave was a very well-rounded student, obviously, with his history and art upbringing. Home systems and social imagination were his two best subjects. I'll get into that later. But Mr. Felix was trying to say, no, Gustave. Shun the arts. Shun those things. Lean into the science. We need more scientists. And try and convert him. And I had this image of perhaps Gustave's best friend, we'll call him Roman, was also similar to Gustave, but he was won over by Mr. Felix and ended up just studying the uncontextualized maths.
Right. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but you think that's, I guess if you had a kid who had a flair for the humanities, maybe it would be a little bit of a soul-sucking, I guess it's not really a teacher's job anyway.
No, the reason I chose this is because often in school, you have kids aren't like born math or art, but we try and divide them.
Okay, I got it.
And I'm saying in the Solacene, the goal of everyone should be to be both.
So it would have been similarly bad if you had an arts teacher who was saying shun the sciences. I got it.
Yeah. So it could have been either or. It could have been an art teacher who's like, shun the sciences, don't listen to them, just keep painting. Her
name would be Madame Roux.
Yeah.
Does he learn any other languages, by the way?
I'll get into that.
Okay. Just because I didn't want him to be like this ultra crazy, gifted, unattainable. He's an everyman, as we were saying.
Exactly. That's why now I'll talk about his schooling. So, as I said, his two best classes were home systems and social imagination. As always, those are made up because we make up everything. So, home systems is how to run an efficient home. And this talks about energy efficiency, water efficiency. It talks about all those elements, perhaps even insulation, how to physically build a house.
Yeah. It's
a combo of that plus the traditional home ec skills of cooking and sewing. It's not a 1-year course. It's built throughout their whole education. And he was really good at this and really good at finding ways to kind of smush together perhaps the water efficiency with cooking a good meal and those types of things.
I had a similar note, and perhaps this is also inspired by his year in the woods, as we were saying.
Yeah.
Regarding the way that he embodies tactility in the Solacene, I think he has that kind of engineering brain.
Yeah.
And this is also maybe us projecting a bit because, as we were saying, we're basically designing a person who will be all the things that we would like to be, but will never be. I have a terrible brain for such things, but I'm always very impressed by people who have a systems-oriented thinking. So I was also thinking maybe along these lines, in his spare time, he likes to build furniture. He is a bit of a budding carpenter. And in brackets, in my notes, I just said, Christ.
Cool.
So
similar to Christ, who was a carpenter.
Indeed.
I think we prefaced this by saying, it'll be an overfilled life. But when you think about it, life is quite long. If you live to be 80, you can do a lot of things. But we tell ourselves you can only do 1 or 2 things. You have to be an expert in them both. But you can be good at a lot of things. And you can explore a lot of things. It's definitely a younger person's mentality because a lot of grandparents and older people had one career. They were at a company for 60 years. But with us, and I think even our parents, it's much more common to jump around.
Yeah, and I think even career, because we don't maybe speak to those people or they lost time a bit, you say, oh, he spent 60 years working on the railroads.
Yeah.
But it's like he did other things in his life. And he knew other people and went other places very often.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're getting at with our Gustave Gump.
Yeah.
That's his surname, by the way.
Okay. Social imagination is the other course he was very good at. And this course is where the students learn about existing economic, political, and social systems, but then are inspired and taught how to critically think about developing new ones. So this will play a role in his later life. We'll get to it. But these two were quite foundational for him, and he was very good at them, very invested in them. When he was 13, he started volunteering as a tour guide in the museums of art. But then by walking around and talking about these pieces, he started to have an interest in the minds of the people who made them and how he could develop his mind to be a bit more like theirs. Because up until this point, as we often talk about, if all of your input is art versions of stuff, but not the actual flowers that they're based off of, it can shift how you then create art or you then perceive the world. So that's when his interest in the real world started to bud, age 13.
Maybe this is also the year he asks, why is he named Gustave?
Yeah.
So he starts to learn. Maybe that's his in, when he gets really into learning about Moreau as a person.
Yeah.
Not just as a painter.
And then we fast forward to him graduating.
Graduating
high school.
Grade school. Okay.
Yeah. So after he graduates, he does what a lot of people perhaps want to do, but don't do as much anymore, and took a
gap year.
Took a gap year.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Maybe it's because, again, me projecting, I always wanted to have that one experience, which kind of is a formal transition from childhood to adulthood, and you feel like in this period you are matured. And it's kind of what distinguishes a teenager from an adult. And I think we've talked a little bit on this podcast before about the difficulties of rites of passage, or the lack thereof, in our kind of secular, materialistic modern world. And yeah, maybe Gustave finds his own way through this by living on a boat for 6 months, or traveling around by himself, or I don't know, swimming the channel, something like that. He does something, or maybe it could be even, if we want to get emotional, maybe he runs away.
He could.
Maybe he is feeling a little bit of pressure from his father, the failed anthropologist, who maybe by this point has picked up the drink a little bit too much, and Gustave, he just can't handle it, and he just leaves.
Okay.
So that's just an idea.
So he takes a year.
A year or so.
Eat, pray, love. Year.
Eat, pray, love, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then he runs out of money, we'll say.
Of course.
And then he decides, okay, I'll go back and work for that food co-op. They have a nice bakery. I'd like to learn how to bake bread.
Yeah.
Whatever.
I had another idea, which is that he's not quite a theatre kid.
I have that too.
You like that idea too?
Yeah.
But I think he has this complicated relationship with theatre, where he was never the one on stage, but I see him maybe enjoying painting sets or working on props.
Yeah.
We had an acquaintance in undergrad who was in the production design program of our school's theatre degree, which I always thought was really funny. And do you remember how excited he got that one time about the pretzel that he made?
Yeah, he made a pretzel for a prop in the play. You and I went to see the play, and we were there just for the pretzel.
It was good though.
It was a good play.
Big.
It was a good pretzel.
Yeah, it was a big pretzel.
Way to go.
So I think he is kind of around the arts and around theatre in that way.
Yeah,
I mean, it's similar
agree.
to his mum, the art curator.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe she's not very often putting brush to canvas. She lost that dream many a moon ago. But
she's always been around theatre.
Exactly.
Okay, that's funny because I have that in his later life as well.
Okay.
It resurfaces, we'll say.
Yeah, so he kind of he reconciles that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you how when we get to it. So he's working at the bakery, just saving up a bit of money, and then his co-bakers say to him, Gustave, you should go study. And in the Solacene, perhaps the programs aren't as strict as they are now. They're a bit more free, build your own sort of thing. So
yeah, I think so. You're talking about maybe not everyone who is a student is a capital S student. There's a bit more blurring the lines between life and study.
Yeah, I like the idea of saying he's studying, not he's a student. Because one could say that about you and I. We're not enrolled in university courses, but we're both working on different things that we're, to an extent, studying.
I'd like to say that about myself.
Yeah. So he went to study. He actually went on an exchange. So he went to another country, and this is where he picks up another language.
Right.
Yeah.
Which one? Oh, we don't want to really place it to.
So we're not placing it. So it's like he could. I'm picturing it being something very different. So it's something with a different script. So perhaps Gustave lives in Japan and he went to study in Europe, or vice versa. Some kind of really challenging language. So that was a big part of the study, was the cultural aspect. But what he focused on in school was gardening and art, like applied arts.
Okay.
Because up until this point, as I said, he was much more of an observer, but now he wants to get his hands dirty, and the gardening relates to the food co-op and all of that. And in university, we'll call it university for the sake of it, he meets his wife.
I was thinking, that was one of my notes as well. Marries early, and what I put on the page was just, marry young, exclamation point. No distractions.
It's good.
Because you don't want him to have to be a playboy through his 30s and 40s. And he's just marries young. What's his wife's name? Cynthia. Marries Cynthia, and they just, they're soulmates. So there's almost not that much to say about it. Cynthia, maybe she get her own episode in a few months.
Yeah, because I don't want to go into too much about Cynthia, but these points will be important. So she was studying ceramics. They met in a sculpture class because he was studying applied arts, and she's also an author. So that's something that Gustave doesn't really know much about, is literature.
Right.
So
actually, that works pretty well.
See, we have the same wavelength.
Each episode, I like to bring a quote, which I usually source from some book or a website or something. And for this semester, they've mostly been from biographies about the person or quotes by the subjects that we're celebrating. Of course, this is a fictional invented person, so it's a fictional invented quote. And as we were saying, he's not necessarily famous enough to ever warrant a biography. But I was thinking, what are the most lasting words of the average person? You have like a tombstone, an obituary, but I didn't want to get that morbid with it. So I thought that in the Solacene, a nice practice might be that we kind of write about each other just casually. Like even if they're your friends or your loved ones, your husband, wife, not necessarily full books, but we write things to and of each other. I think this will maybe scratch some of the social media itch, whereas instead of it being a status or a caption on IG, like we just, maybe it's in a journal or something like that, or maybe it's in a letter. Like a letter's a good idea. So the quote I had, which I suppose can be from his wife Cynthia, who, as you mentioned, is a writer. This comes later in life after he's been gardening for quite a bit. And she said, "He has a smile and arm as of his gardens. No more landscaped, fair, and seasonally correct model of a man could be summoned by a single flower's thoughts." And obviously she knew him better than anyone. Yeah. Almost as well as us. And I really like this phrasing that she used of seasonally correct, because I was going to say he was always lively or he was always contemplative, but instead I like this idea of him being so kind of in tune with the world around him, especially that of nature, that he is almost a barometer for how things are.
I like that.
You know what I mean? He's contemplative in the winter, he's lively in the summer, he rises with the spring, and in the fall he changes color.
Yeah. Okay, sweet.
Something like that.
I like that. So when he comes back from university, wife in arm, he begins what I'll call his career.
Right.
So his career is really focusing on beautification of the city's gardens, and he begins to build a reputation as a sort of hedge sculptor. But he doesn't just sculpt hedges, that's the only beautification we think of, but even community gardens, he and Cynthia would build interesting pots and boxes, and so everything became a sculpture, and over his time working on these things, he starts to really be recognized for his contribution to the community.
Yeah, I had him spending like 4 or 5 years working at a hotel, because that's always been something of a distant dream or longing of mine, purely because of the film The Grand Budapest Hotel. And I think it would be such a nice and interesting and kind of difficult job in a kind of old-timey sense, not necessarily something like a Best Western, but if this is a more, let's say, decentralized world that he's living in, then he starts off maybe doing the hedges, but gradually people come in, regulars start to recognize him always working outside, and maybe someone asks him to dine with them. It's a little bit like Titanic or something like that. Yeah. So he's always kind of rubbing shoulders with people from all four corners, which I think is a neat idea.
I like that.
And over time, he gains a more substantial role in the hotel and kind of falls in love with that side of things. And I had the idea that he tries to start his own inn, maybe with Cynthia, and it fails miserably.
As a way to sort of promote the town, put it on the map.
Yeah, maybe.
Because he liked the way that this inn was run, and he thought, our town needs something like this, we'll try and create it. Yeah. Does it fail, similar to his father?
Yeah, he doesn't tend to drink, though, but it does. I did have the idea that it fails miserably. I feel like everyone needs a an endeavor when you're like 31 or something, or 28, that you try it, but it just does not work. It doesn't work at all. And I think maybe in this case, it could be because he put so much time into the hedges and flowers outside that he forgot to, let's say, wash the sheets. Or something like that. There's some, I won't say he's disgraced, but he kind of leaves this with his tail between his legs a little bit.
Okay, interesting.
Or it had a really terrible gimmicky idea. Like it was one of those treehouse hotels, but the world was just past that or something.
Yeah, I see. He was obsessed with the idea of everyone sleeping in pots, in terracotta pots. And they said this isn't comfortable. Yeah. But he was too fixed on it.
Pots filled with soil. That's what the mattress was.
He said it's like the earthing hotel or something. Yeah. So he fails that. I think then him and Cynthia perhaps decide, let's take a few years, settle down.
They go back to the drawing board a little bit.
Go back to the drawing board. And in that time, they've had some children.
7, let's say.
7 children. Whatever. And so those kids are all great and good. But then one time when one of the kids is in high school, they're in a play, a community play, but then the lead actor is actually falls ill. And there's no one to play the role, so they have to call up Gustave.
No.
To take on the role.
So Gustave is what, 40 years old?
No, it's a community play.
Okay.
So it's intergenerational. Okay. I know. So his daughter says, Gustave, because that's what she calls him.
Right.
You're going to have, we need someone. Is there any chance? And he says, don't worry about it. I've got it, because he'd seen this play so many times.
Oh, okay. So
the
this is when
community troupe puts it on all the time.
This is when he kind of makes peace with drama, which had always been knocking on the door of his life, but he's always been kind of deliberately keeping himself from, because he doesn't know what's going to happen when he sets foot on that stage.
Exactly.
Sings to himself. People close to him say he actually has quite a nice voice.
Yeah.
Similar to me. But he's never quite performed, let's say, in public.
So it took, the first act when he was on stage was quite rough, similar to Troy Bolton, you could say. And then he comes into his own in Act 2, and the third act is a blowout. Everyone stands up, round of applause, but he retires after that. He doesn't want to. He can't beat that performance,
of
really.
Course. He goes out on top.
Yeah. And then after that, that was his presentation to the community. Everyone knew about him based on his gardening and his beautification, but this really put him on the map, and it was actually an election year.
Oh.
So he decides to run for
mayor. I like mayor.
Yeah. And then he actually gets elected. And his project that he works on is a unity project, we're going to call it. And his goal is to unify the town's aesthetics. And basically, the town has really valued this. It's not him imposing.
Right, so there's no economic platform. It's just...
No, it's aesthetic.
Okay.
But it's what you and I talk about often is things that are aesthetic are often sustainable. There's a link.
Mm-hmm. I had another idea, which is at some point he could be a coral cleaner, which is a job I just invented for the Solacene, where there's some kind of magic seed or plant discovered which de-acidifies the ocean, and you can plant it around coral or on them, and it fixes them. So maybe this could be part of his job as mayor, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I like that.
He unites his gardening experience with his political power.
Yeah.
And so the coral, because it's an oceanside town maybe that he's the mayor of, they all kind of, there's a little bit of a musical montage where they're all on the beaches on their knees. Someone falls in and everyone kind of laughs, or they're like, basically there's a crab on someone's hand, starts crying. Crab.
Cool. So he's in office not for too long. It's similar to his theater career. It's just came, I saw, I conquered.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Trump.
In his later years, he decides, I'm going to produce a film, and Cynthia's going to write it. Just a short film, they'll show it at a local festival or whatever. And it's about the story that the town tells through its architecture and gardening. And that's just a little side note. It's not great, but it's aired like the town library, and everyone gives it a little applause, and everyone likes it because it features their grandmother or what have you. And so that was really, for me, I went up until he was about 45, 50.
Oh, wow. Okay. I thought he was older than that. So what I heard for his end of life is basically he gets into teaching.
Well, that's the thing. I knew that he got into teaching, so I didn't want to go that. I feel when he's a teacher, he's 50 to 70.
Maybe I guess our timelines are a little bit off, because I was thinking he'd be a politician in his 50s. That would be kind of, because he has to have had experience in many different fields and to have met several different people around the town. But I was also thinking sometime during his midlife, he goes on a Bilbo-like adventure. Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbits.
Yeah.
Something that's always struck me about that story is that Bilbo tells the tales from that journey for decades and decades after the fact. But really it was just 1 year that he was gone for. I think it was 1 year. And there weren't that many different encounters he had. It was like he saw the trolls, he saw Gollum, there were the wolves, and there was the dragon. But it's like really there was only like 5 or 6 different stories he could tell. But it's the way that some lives, or maybe most lives, or many lives, really they're punctuated by 1 or maybe 2 adventures. Right? And it sounds really like a kind of demoralizing thing to say, but I don't think it is. It's just that almost always there's kind of a contrast between everyday life and your Bilbo quest, which doesn't make the everyday life less valuable is kind of the point I was getting at. Like when you have a day and you have the day marked for weeks ahead of time because this is the day you have a big ceremony or you're getting an award or it's a big dance or whatever. Like there's a day that's marked really by one big thing. It doesn't make the rest of the day nothingness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was trying to get at here. I was thinking maybe he goes and is recruited to help work on the new hanging gardens. For one of the Solacene wonders of the world.
Yeah. Cool. Perhaps his short film reaches the right people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking maybe he has a little bit of a midlife crisis, or do you think that's not a Solacene concept at all?
No, maybe not calling it a crisis, but as I said at the beginning, we often think our lives have to be one thing, and Gustave perhaps thought he was defined by his gardens.
Yeah.
But midlife, he realizes, I've done what I can with the gardens.
His kids are aging.
Yeah.
Cynthia, well, the less said about her, maybe, the better. No, but maybe it was a little bit inspired by the idea of the quarter life crisis. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a valid crisis to have? And in the Solacene,
well, I'm knocking on it, so yeah.
You're knocking on the quarter life crisis?
Yeah.
What I was kind of reflecting on my own mini quarter life crisis, because I think 25 is like quarter life, or 20 to 25. I guess the midlife crisis is characterized by this fear of death, and people often, I think, ascribe it to men. It's like this fear of like you're losing your virile masculinity or something like that. And I think the quarter life crisis is this fear of like it's close to a fear of death, but it's more like a fear of not having lived yet.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really, really associated with digital lives. And when you're like, oh, that was 10 years ago, I'm too young to be forgetting time like this and to not have strong memories. So I think Gustave, he's raised properly and he's raised screenless, so he might not have this. But maybe for his midlife crisis, he chooses a new profession, gets into teaching, goes back to school, gets a new degree or something like that. But also maybe he writes a bucket list. Is that a Solacene concept, a bucket list? Or does he live too much in the moment for that kind of thing?
I don't picture Gustave having a bucket list.
I just think he needs to somehow be a bit more familiar with death.
Okay.
Like maybe he or aging. Maybe he needs to make peace with that a little bit more. Like maybe he starts going to a hospital or something, or going to a retirement home periodically. Okay. Maybe his mum is in a retirement home and he starts visiting her properly. Yeah. He starts talking about the art because he's discovering the art that she's always been in love with, but he's like, remember this piece? And in doing so, he is, I think squaring the circle is the phrase, about like uniting his youth and his career and what's to come for all of us. Death. That's
an interesting way of putting the essence of the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
So I see that likely is a part of every person's experience then.
Yeah, I don't think it's just like he's going to go out and buy a new car or whatever. It's not that. It's kind of a reckoning about aging and death, mortality.
But he does go out and buy a tandem bike as well.
Tandem bike? Him and Cynthia?
Him and Cynthia.
That's how they fix their marriage?
Yeah.
So I think having kind of made peace with his various relationships like this, maybe one of his estranged siblings, they reunite after caring for their mother or something. it really kind of opens the curtain for the third act of his life, which is teaching. And I didn't have too many notes on this, except he's teaching because he now has things to teach. And I don't think it's necessarily bad that so many of our young people today get out of school and think, I don't know what to do, I'll teach. But I do think there's wisdom in it, often being older, more experienced figures.
Yeah, you don't want to be a Mr. Felix who went right from high school into teaching math.
Makes sense.
Because he doesn't know. He doesn't know what the numbers mean. He's never seen a pie.
Maybe also when he's teaching, Mr. Felix is just retiring and they kind of...
They reconcile.
Yeah.
Mr. Felix says, I always knew you had it in you, boy.
Exactly.
Something like that.
I voted for you, he could say.
I like that. Cool.
So teaching, there's not much to say about that. He just kind of... I think he teach quite young people. That seems like a Gustavian thing. Maybe he's giving them field trips to the same museum that he was often growing up around, or something like that. And just one final note on the Solacene, on the 3 Solacene traits, sustainability. How could someone really embody that ethos, which we again so often just subscribe to things and systems? There's obviously the environmental sustainability, which he cares for deeply, I think, and is demonstrated in his gardening work and his coral cleaning, his political impact as mayor. But also, I think, generally, it's just the concept of trying to give more than you get. That's what makes you a sustainable force. We can talk about it more socially. And it seems like a bit of an oxymoron because for sustainability, you'd think, but you need to give approximately what you get, or it needs to be equal. But I feel like if you're drawing from a deep well of life mindfulness, because I think he's a big meditator, as is Gustave, you can at least to the outside eye give more than you get. You know what I mean?
I like that.
Like maybe he donates quite a lot.
Yeah. There's the concept of the sustainable harvest, and that is taking like a third. And you'll always give an offering when you take something from nature, and that's can be applied to our lives of offering before we take, and even when we do take, taking less than we think we need. Yeah. Taking just like the minimum to start with and see what it can do.
Cynthia, though, the less said about her, the better, I think. I just picture her being quite greedy. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Thank you all for listening. If you liked the weird concept, listen to the other episodes in our semester. They're a little bit more regular and biographical. And you can also buy our zines. They're in the link in the description. Alicia makes clothes. They're on the wall behind her. And you can also buy them through the link in the description. We're on YouTube. You can see us. And I had a poem to close it out rather than to open it today. So it says, that scene written and mimed, characterized by golden ghosts, yet costumed, humble hosts who feast prepare, so sky and tree the landscape share, so air the blue horizons wear. Figures of a sun-hewn solar scene. Haven't I dreamt you? Haven't you been?